Dog, what is this?
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man? Get your ass.
I don't know if you guys remember the old days when the classic bubble tea was introduced to the West. The one with the milk tea with like the tapioca pearls? How much polarizing skepticism there was.
Oh my god.
Now the whole scene's completely changed. You know, we're seeing the whole philosophy change. We're seeing a huge boom in the popularity. We're seeing new drink creations being made. And we're seeing it being a part of modern culture and identity. But really, did the drink itself change? Or were we the ones that changed?
Be its first venture into mainland Europe.
Is celebrated as Bubble Tea Day.
Bubble tea. We all love this sweet treat so much.
去年利润腰斩，所以呢，业者只好出海找出路。但是呢。
Y'all remember Easy Way, Share Tea, the early days of chat time? You know, the good old traditional blood sugar spike we always crave. I'm sure the word boba or bubble tea or pearl milk tea, or just the notion and concept of what it is, I think is quite well understood now by the majority of the world. But as you likely saw from the title of the video, I think the rise and change of the first few iterations is quite noticeable to the casual consumer, you know, with much more innovative design choices, ingredient choices, and I think just overall better quality in my opinion. So let's rewind it a bit and take a tour back to the 80s, where it originated in Taiwan, where voila, discovered you could add fenyuan, you know, the famous sweetened tapioca that was already quite popular as a dessert ingredient, to tea. And from this, domestically, emerged a new drink where they even need a different kind of straw to drink from. Yep, that exact thick straw that we see now and use effortlessly. And okay, I didn't even know this until I was researching. But yeah, the actual name and term we've coined it in English, boba or boba. Yeah, this was the origin of where it came from. So yeah, if there's anything you can take away from this video and click off, hopefully you have this at least in mind, but let's continue. Then from Taiwan, it spread to neighboring Asian countries, and this timeline I'll diverge into two, with one being the West and the other being mainland China. But most pivotally in the 90s, you know, Taiwanese immigrants brought along this beverage culture through diaspora networks and slowly but surely introduced it to other Asian American cultures, you know, through neighborhoods, social circles, and before long, real physical standalone boba shops started to pop up like Tenren, Tapioca Express, you know, near areas of Asian supermarkets or restaurants. This time period is also when boba stores started to appear in Hong Kong, you know, China, and we'll talk about it later in this video, but this is also the time when Mixue was established too. And I'd say through the 2000s, the popularity slowly but steadily increased all across the world, with brands that are still here to this day, you know, like Chatime, Gongcha, Coco, Lollicup quickly, and business-wise, I think started to really transform as an item for a more budget-friendly, mass, you know, younger Asian demographic market, especially near high schools or universities. But noticeably, the making and limited variety of the bubble tea back then was usually pre-made through extremely artificial, you know, albeit cheap means like powdered milk, artificial cream powders, syrups, you know, and other pre-made elements, and not like the usual stuff we see today. And then into the early mid-2010s is when we see other factors coming into play. You know, with YouTube, Instagram, I think just media in general, the popularity and culture surrounding it was definitely becoming a lot more established. I don't know if y'all remember Boba Life by Fung Brothers, but yeah. So in a sense, I think this is where the original Asian diasporic community-driven quirky drink item, I think, became an actual and competitive beverage market that was able to expand into the West and all over the world. I mean, we can see physically, like the stores look and feel way more furbished, you know, with some with actual seating areas, or at least an area to enjoy your drink, you know, a much larger array of variety, your order actually being made fresh in real time with ingredients, you know, still a little suspect, but we'll get into that later. And leading the pack during this time from, you know, where I grew up here is probably Gongcha, Share Tea, and Chat Time. And for my American viewers, please do let me know what stores were the most popular during the 2010s, because I'm reading this blog post and she mentions how Half and Half changed up the traditional milk tea cups and offered a variety of extremely dessert-focused drinks. Some other shops include Factory Tea Bar, Share Tea, and Mr. Green Bubble. And then I would say mid to late 2010s is the true inflection point, and shift, and sort of a precursor to what we see nowadays with its global mainstream popularity and dominance. You know, from New York to Cali, London to Paris, Tokyo, Italy, Hong Kong to Brazil. Apart from larger chains, smaller indie stores also started to pop up around locations, you know, with larger Asian demographic populations to capture this growing market, you know, with stores that I know of like, you know, Machi Machi, King Tea, etc. We also see the industry reshuffled to having more premium ingredients with their tea and milk, and transparency with their customers. This time period is where, you know, Haiti, Tiger Sugar, you know, came up with more trendy flavors. You know, if we remember that cheese foam, brulee foam, milk foam, the whole brown sugar aesthetic thing. So we can see there's a lot more thought and strategy going into this whole industry, as there are increasing competitors on the market, and slowly as well, I think really starting to shift into an aesthetic appreciation that is visually appealing in photos, you know, with the different concoctions being made. Back to the comment I made earlier on the suspect ingredients used in the 2010s, I think it was this very factor that led and transformed the industry to what we see nowadays. You know, for example, there was a whole scandal in Taiwan back in 2011 where it was discovered that phthalate plasticizers were used instead of palm oil as the clouding agent for a lot of drinks, which, as science points out, can cause developmental and reproductive issues in children. And as back then, Taiwan, you know, was the major powerhouse in bubble tea production and supply chain logistics, it naturally ripples towards other global supply chains. And I think China, again, especially at that time, I think becoming more and more health conscious from this time was definitely like, what the f, you know, let's make our own version then. And from this, I think a shift in 2012 happened. A coined term known as 新式茶饮 became, you know, the mainstay, you know, prioritizing premium tea leaves, you know, fresh fruit chunks, and, you know, organic cane sugar. You know, even smaller aspects like replacing the shrink-wrapped tops to lidded cups, you know, with two major powerhouses like Huangcha and Naixue. You know, the former now being famously called Xicha, or Haiti, or Heita. And so I think it was this sort of small history that contributed and combined, you know, with all the other factors like social media presence, wanting to post a viral photo of a pretty looking drink, you know, catering to Gen Z and, you know, globalization, that I think eventually became the cultural expansion and inflection point that I mentioned earlier. And again, this is my timeline that I'm making and just what I believe. I think in mainland China now, in the 2020s, you have the aforementioned Mixue, having at that time over 10,000 stores locally, and then throughout the last few years, the total amount of bubble tea shops is estimated to have around 500,000 stores in China alone, potentially, and hot take, I think truly starting to outcompete coffee shops entirely. And in my opinion, you know, you have Bawang Chaji, Moli Naibai, Xicha. I think they're probably the big three right now, with now an emphasis of Guotao and an Eastern modern aesthetic branding that is seeping to the international scale. And I think it's honestly quite a big thing. Like, they established themselves not only in super high foot traffic locations, but, you know, even close to offices and CBD areas of, you know, major global cities in the world. Like, we see compared to like 10 years ago, you know, the packaging, the cups, you know, the straws, the store interior, the pricing, all completely different to back then. Like, for the instances of Molly tea and, you know, Chaji, like the whole floral flavor is, I guess, one of the many unique elements that bring in so many customers. But it's also not to say, you know, the older generation of bubble tea is completely non-existent. You know, stores like Coco, Gongcha are still going strong. But the talk of the town, the virality, is definitely being handed over. Now, there are many different iterations of the evolution, some splitting it into first to fourth wave, but all of it cover the entire essence of how, quite literally, we transition from powdered instant milk tea with tapioca as a sort of stereotypical Asian dessert to borderline tea brands and companies listed on public stock exchanges, catering to a global consumer demand, you know, using real higher quality authentic tea leaves that, you know, we can see being brewed, fresh milk, hell of a lot more variety of toppings that are a lot more nutritious, proper cafe seating, etc. Like, truthfully, I think the whole tapioca thing is barely emphasized now. Statistically also, the expansion of the premium freshly made tea grew from 100 billion RMB in 2019 to around 270 billion in 2024, and is projected to reach, you know, onwards to 420 billion by 2028. Or in another perspective, it will take up nearly a third of the entire bubble tea market by 2028. And topped off back to the guotao element, there's like whole backstories, national pride, whole history behind it, and a whole sophisticated law, behind that brand to enforce and spread the historic aesthetic of Chinese culture to the wider world. And also, something I just discovered after researching, HeyTea collabed with Fendi? Like, I did not hear about this. That's kind of insane. Like, bubble tea with fashion brands? Also, the whole drama with Molly T and LV regarding the logo, but yeah, I feel that story shows a bit too much with what I want to talk about in this video. Now, a few reasons for what I think pushed this change, and I feel like it always comes to this as well as my other videos. Rising incomes, a young market demographic, social media presence, and being more health conscious. But I feel right now, society as a whole does push and demand a more healthier and slightly more premium alternative. Like that instant powdered milk thing, I think would definitely not stand a chance in today's market and mentality. Or more specifically, if we're emphasizing the Asian American community, I feel the generation that grew up with that drink, I think in some ways, grew out of it too. Like not in a bad sense, but perhaps we subconsciously and innately want a reflection of our current stage of life or our current perceived lifestyle that we're in. And so would probably like a more grown up, a more mature and more sophisticated type of drink. And with social media, like God, you can imagine the rebranding and marketing to the elegant modern design fusion of, ancient Chinese motifs and traditional arts, of the store and drink will generate huge clicks and numbers. But that's the sort of Western perspective into things. I keep mentioning one particular store earlier in this video, which was Mixue. I would say this is where that linear transition becomes a bit fuzzy if we generalize all of bubble tea. And I suppose this is also a good time to mention the pricing of all of these drinks. Respective of inflation, the Molly teas, the Chajis, they aren't cheap. As a premium option now, like some of them can go over $8 AUD or probably like 20 RMB. Whereas a while back, I remember paying like $4 to $5 for a bubble tea. But Mixue, now is like the foil character in this video. It's sort of been lurking in the shadows ever since the 2000s as a regional ice cream and tea shop, but followed suit with the bubble tea boom. And yeah, regardless of what we think, of the difference in quality and taste, a consistent drink that goes for, like under 10 RMB in China and around 2 to 5 AUD, in today's economy, I think it's very, very hard to come by. I think much of it is built on a solid supply chain foundation, which in turn creates lower costs. And according to this article, as of 2025, over 40,000 stores domestically, surpassing even McDonald's in mainland China, and became the second largest private employer right behind Walmart. And yeah, they hold the largest market share by far. And significantly, yes, the premium share percentage is growing fast alongside it as well. And the buzz and social media presence, I think, will always favor the premium and aesthetic alternative. But the entire boom and market increase will always be backed by this, large budget chain. So rather to say a generalization that, the premium options are dethroning and taking over, it's more so of a splitting off and a sort of developing itself as a new category entirely. This leads to my next point, saturation. And I think a good segue and link to the other face of the coin, with so many stores in China, especially for lower end budget options, being utterly dominated by Mixue already, and middle tier options being at a price war with each other, I think people living in Western countries don't know how incredibly competitive and ruthless the bubble tea market is in China. As I said, over 500,000 stores domestically, that's around one store for every 3,000 people, a tenfold to the American ratio of 1 every 30,000. Or, at major metropolises like Guangzhou, it's more so like one store for every 1,500 people. Even saying how more than 130,000 milk tea shops were forced to liquidate in 2025, owing to weak sales. But we also see that the growth is slowing down and decelerating the past year. And a symptom of such saturation is the diversion to global markets. And backed by the novelty and the guotao I mentioned earlier, it's, I think, been quite successful in my opinion. Like the prices of Molly tea and Chaji remain very high because the demand meets the requirement. But hell, remember when HeyTea had massive store closures all over the world? I think it's one of many cautionary tales of this business where, yeah, one of the primary reasons leading to this was, more competition, less customers, less sales, discounting its products to entice customers, slashing profits down, shutting stores down. But it's also worth mentioning, I think, that while it's slowly stagnating, interestingly enough, delivery order volumes are still rising. So there could be some sort of relationship where you can consolidate the drink orders without as many physical stores being located, introducing a whole different perspective on how store businesses will be run. I made a quick Google search of bubble tea stores around the quote-unquote Chinese suburb in Sydney and decided to see how many I could spot, walking along the main street with my friend. So, yep, here's just going to be me doing a voiceover along the sped up footage. I think all in all, it took like around 30 minutes in total. We started in the middle, walked to the top, and then we circled back to the bottom, and then circled back to the middle. And you can probably see I am doing some weird hand gestures with my right hand, but I promise these are not gang signs. These are, I think, the Chinese counting system. I think there are like different variants, but I'm just following one that I'm just going to reference here. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I lost count after 10, as you guys will see later, that I just sort of gave up and stopped storing it up. And then my friend mentioned how like the Chinese cities are probably way worse in terms of saturation, but I think it's still pretty significant that, even in a Western country, that there are still, so many that we could spot. And, not just in this particular suburb, like I know other suburbs also have just as much like bubble tea stores. But I think I'm walking along, yeah, Molly Tea here, there's a lot of people here, which is kind of crazy, but it's Friday night though, so I think it's kind of understandable. And this was just the main attraction along the main street. I just think it looked really good on camera. And here we go, I'm pretty sure, yep, this is a diabolical snapshot of some Molly Tea bags along the trash. Also too, the whole rise in timeline, I think mirrors and parallels to the timeline of coffee. From like instant coffee to Starbucks to artisanal coffee shops. That third space where people can relax, study, hang out, etc. I feel is where I genuinely want the industry to start heading towards. Like not just like a lounge area where, on the side, there's like a bubble tea shop, or, just a store with, only a couple, seating areas, but an actual designated entire floor space just for and made specifically for the customers. We can already recognize how it has, already commercialized the beverage, not just as a drink, but as a social incentive with how it's marketed, and with even some claiming it's already a part of daily habit and, ironically, reverting back as an eating accompaniment too, instead of a one-off treat. Devil's advocate, some may say that this whole thing would just be like a phase. Brands always suddenly come out of nowhere and explode in popularity and virality due to social media and die down super quickly, with another new brand taking the throne. A sort of like similar comparison maybe to like how flavors like matcha and ube are, sort of a cycle popularity. But I still want to recognize the trend that it is going and the sort of staying power it's actually leaving behind. Future outlook on this could potentially shift towards even more healthier ingredients and drink ideas, like corn silk tea, red ginseng, and all the other healthy ingredients and alternatives we're used to seeing now in other food products, like dairy substitutes, natural sweeteners. Like at some point, I think there might be a whole entire philosophy change where back then, people craved it as a guilty pleasure that was, probably not too beneficial for the health, to potentially an actual, guilt-free pleasure that is actually genuinely good for our health. Otherwise, some key points I also want to highlight from the Mortar report summary of global bubble tea market, that shops are shifting towards automated brewing and more precise ways for making the drink, or in corporate terms, to fully automate the entire process so that the drink is made consistently and way more efficiently. There's also intentions on more micro stores appearing in train stations or airports, more plant-based and halal certified variants, unlocking an entire new market share. Hell, even Cappy Bubble, You know, the Coca-Cola drink was mentioned, which goes to show even carbonated drink industry giants are seeing bubble tea as a genuine competition. Also, another sub-market extending from this boom is the ready-to-drink bubble tea options that you can find quite often now in Asian grocery stores, characterized by their, large plastic lids instead of conventional caps. And I think just the whole concept of bubble tea itself as a flavoring, I think goes to show the significant impact it's had, and I suppose the impressive legacy it's leaving behind, respective of the evolution that's occurring. Yo, okay, this actually works. Now, yeah, to end the video, I suppose I want to just reflect back and just get a little personal to what it meant for us, our Asians that grew up in Western countries. I think back to my older brother's generation, where I think bubble tea was still definitely seen as like a stereotype and an integrated element that is, I think, shared only amongst the Asian community. And I think, unfortunately, if he was in the wrong crowd, I think he definitely could have, been made fun of. And luckily, when I grew up with it, I was definitely on the last sort of tail end of it being a niche and was getting more respect amongst, all cultures. Or like if I mention, bubble tea to an Asian person that is like of similar age, like they'll immediately know like what I'm talking about. Of course, nowadays being so mainstream to not only, youth culture, but modern culture entirely, I think the connotation of it being Asian in like a demeaning sense, I think is rapidly fading away. And to us back then, with others reflecting on it too, a sort of perfect encapsulation to what I want to share and a bit more of a deep down to what it is. It felt like a kind of secret language for which only my Asian American friend, a currency of exchange in a foreign landscape in which I otherwise felt lost and alone. It's emblematic of this abstract idea of home-rooted in the Asian American community and the global Asian diaspora at large. It's given me home everywhere that I go. As a teenager, I felt a lot of pride around this beverage. In that era, I just wanted anything Asian. That era being marked by an increased acceptance among Asian Americans of Asian pop culture exports, like anime, the first wave of K-pop idol groups, Filipino American R&B groups. Going to say that now, because of the bubble tea revolution, that it is quintessential passing off the baton from American hegemony to East Asian hegemony. It's symptomatic of East Asia's location, of East Asian urban culture in the global circulation of taste. And yeah, trust me, the more I read this article, it goes really, really deep into essentially how, the joking, the display, the memes of iconic symbols of Asian American identity, usually composing of food and drinks like ramen, Korean barbecue, pocky, bubble tea, actually promotes our shared identity. Because culinary culture is, quote, as a universal language that can be praised and integrated into Western culture. And specifically for bubble tea, I think it was a way for past generations of Asian Americans to really put their foot on the door and shape our identity to what it is now. So after everything, what do I think about this? The whole history, the whole evolution of the bubble tea stuff. I think it's quite endearing. I don't think I knew anyone that was gatekeeping the bubble tea drink. And I think we all appreciate now like the origins, and we all appreciate the popularity globally that it's reached right now. Regardless of where it trends in the future, I think I'm just happy that, the drink we once called home is now a drink that is established on modern kinship and a pervasion of a previous cultural identity.